So today we want to look at 1 Corinthians 9, the entire chapter. And this is an ongoing discussion that Paul is having with the Corinthian church, because as we know, we've looked at a lot of their problems up to now and it hadn't stopped. But now apparently they're kind of accusing Paul of not getting in line with the apostle they'd like to have. He's not really what they want. They want somebody that's urbane, somebody that's that preaches eloquently and takes money from them and does what they kind of want. You know, if you look at some of the evangelists out there today, the ones on TV and all, it's kind of like that. They kind of want a Benny Hinn. They don't really want a Paul the Apostle. And he's answering that here, and you can see it. I'm just going to read the whole thing. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I'm not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you're the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living, who serves as a soldier at his own expense, who plants a vineyard without eating some of its fruit, or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for the oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we've sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? What in my preaching, or that in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as to not make full use of my right in the gospel. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I may win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I may win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I may win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we do an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Paul's on a little bit of a rant there, isn't he? Can you blame him? These people have been a problem at every every stop sign he comes to. You know, they're a pain, and he's dealing with them. He's not running from them. There's a long-standing story. Don't know where it came from. A small town in Tennessee. A sign in front of the churches reads Left Foot Baptist Church. Kind of a strange name. Originally, a church in a small town that they practiced foot washing as an ordinance. And you know, some of the more Pentecostal churches do that, and some of these Baptist churches are pretty Pentecostal sometimes. But they had a conflict arose over which foot should be washed first. Now that sounds kind of silly, but when you think back over some of the things that some of us have been, endured, I guess you'd say, maybe it's not so silly after all. I don't know. The group insisting on the left foot taking precedence finally withdrew and formed their own church, and they named it Left Foot Baptist Church. And, you know, it sounds crazy, but churches have split for probably worse reasons than that. You know, you hear about churches splitting over the color of the carpet and all that stuff. But so I don't know if that story's true or not, but if it is, then the church has lost sight of what they're for. I mean, obviously. And in a lot of more subtle ways, church members sometimes lose sight of what they're there for too. One church surveyed its members, and one of the questions was, what do you expect when you come to worship on Sunday morning? And the most popular answer was, we expect to be through by 12 so we can beat the other churches to the restaurant. And you know, does that surprise you any at all? In an exit interview with former church members, another church asked, why do you leave our church? And the most common answer was, we're not being fed. And church growth consultant Win Arn conducted a survey in which he interviewed the members of nearly 1,000 churches in regard to what they perceived to be the mission of the church. 89% said the church exists to take care of my family and my needs. Folks, the church don't exist for that. I mean, it might come as a shock to some people, but it don't. So we don't have to go to Left Foot Baptist Church to discover Christians who've lost sight as to what the church is all about and what the church should be in the community. We hear it from Jesus in Matthew 16, 17, and 19. And we discover along the way that we sometimes lose sight of what it means to be the church. And the single most important statement about the church in the Gospels in Matthew 16, 17, 19, Jesus doesn't say anything about meeting our needs, spiritual or material or whatever. He doesn't say anything about keeping us happy either. He calls us to abandon our needs and set an agenda that meets the needs of the kingdom, bringing the world back into a relationship with Christ, just like Jeff was talking about these young men. That's the true mission of the church right there. And they're probably not affiliated with any particular church, but they are the church when they're out there on the road doing what they're supposed to do. Jesus said, on this rock I will build my church. Then he explains, I'll give you the keys to the kingdom, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So he gave the apostles, and through the apostles us, the power to do that. He said that when they go out with the keys of the kingdom to fulfill his agenda, the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So the church's agenda is not about meeting our needs, even though we need to do that sometimes. That's not our main focus. It's about serving God and completing his agenda. And Paul could see that here. Paul faced the same issue with the members of the Corinthian church. Apparently some of these Corinthian Christians thought the same way. They thought that Paul and the church were there to take care of them. I'm sure some of the poorer members of the church probably thought, Well, now that I'm a Christian, these richer members are going to take care of me and we'll all be fine. And in some ways, that is one of the missions of the church, but not the main mission, not the main thing. And they accused Paul of doing the same thing. They accused him of not really doing what the Lord's saying, take care of us, and he's not doing it. He's preaching. Paul was an evangelist, and he set these churches up to continue that, to continue training Christians and continuing to proclaim the word of God. And he expected these churches, like the church in Corinth, I don't know how many people it had. I'm gonna guess probably 50 to 100. That they should make more churches in Corinth, because Corinth had a huge population. They shouldn't be satisfied with having 100 people or 10 or however many it was, and we shouldn't either. And you see it all the time. Betty Jean was just telling me the other day about a church in our own community that's down to 3 or 4 members, and we're not a long way off from there. Churches in America are dwindling. People have fell in with the devil, and they fell in with secular reasoning and this idea that there is no God, even though people may not say it. They believe it by their actions, and I think we talked about that last week. But he said in verse 1, am I not free? And of course, the answer here would be yes. You're free as a Christian. You're free from the effects of the law. Freedom is one of the benefits of the Christian life. We're free from religious legalism. We're free from the law and what people make up as the law. We're free from that. And Paul recognizes that. In fact, last week, he told us in the last chapter that he's free, but sometimes that's not the thing that's needed. Sometimes it's better to be free but not use that freedom. And in verse 4, Paul asks, don't we have the right to food and drink? Of course, the answer there is yes. Basically, what Paul's saying through this whole thing is, I've got the right to be paid for what I do. And then he goes on to say, but I'm not going to take it. I'm not doing that. Apparently, they were preachers at the time who were, and there's preachers that now that do. And there's nothing wrong with that. Don't get me wrong, A full-time minister deserves to be supported. He does. People who are doing missions and things like that deserve to be supported. I mean, that's the only way it's going to get done. They can't, a preacher that full-time in a larger church, they don't have time to go work somewhere else in a lot of cases. So, and so we recognize that people who serve the Lord have certain privileges, and that's the way it should be. People who lead in service to the kingdom have got a right to those privileges. It's what is it say in the Army? Rank hath its privileges. It does, and it does in Christian service too, somewhat. So anybody who works, it's like Paul says here, am I not free? Don't we have the right to food and drink? And the answer to both questions is yes, but he says we don't use that right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than to hinder the gospel of Christ. He don't want to hinder the spread of the gospel. And he said that in a lot of other places too. And we can read in several of his letters and in Acts how he made tents for a living because he didn't get paid for being a preacher. Maybe he got money sometimes to help him go to the next city or something, but he always worked. He always worked with his hands. So even though certain rights and privileges accompany the Christian life, we shouldn't be taking advantage of those any more than we have to. Our rights and privileges and freedom shouldn't hinder the spread of the gospel. And I think we can all agree with that. So we shouldn't, our focus in church shouldn't be on our rights. Our focus should be on the gospel and on proclaiming Christ. And I hope everyone in here is doing that. You know, when we're out in the world, that we are proclaiming Christ. I always feel inadequate when it comes to that, like I'm not doing it enough. And maybe we should feel that way. So instead of focusing on our rights and privileges, we need to focus on fulfilling our calling. Paul writes, "Yet when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, for I'm compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." So Paul don't preach because it brings him any reward or because he even likes it. He preaches because he's compelled to do it. And being compelled is not the same as wanting to do something. Now, I'm sure Paul wanted to do it at times too. I'm not saying it's not part of your desire. But there is a certain, I know myself, there's a certain compulsion there. You know, even though there's been times that, a lot of times that, you know, it would have been nice for me to give it up because it'd be one thing I wouldn't have to worry about and I wouldn't have to study for every week and all that. But there is a compulsion there that you do what you're supposed to do. Paul says in a later chapter that there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there's different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There's different kinds of working, but the same God works all of them in all men in chapter 12. So every Christian has a gift and every Christian has a calling. And if you don't think that you do, then something's wrong. You need to be looking at that. We all do. We all have a calling. We all have a gift. And so rather than saying my needs aren't being met, we should say, woe to me if I don't do what I'm supposed to be doing, whatever that is. I'm not worried about my rights, Paul asserts. I'm not concerned with my privileges. I'm passionately committed to doing what God has called me to do. And that's where we should place our focus in the church. Verse 19, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I may win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I may win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I may win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I may win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some." Can you imagine that? I mean, he just dove right in, didn't he? And it reminds you of Jesus himself, who they said was a drunkard and a glutton, and he hung out with sinners and went to sinners' parties and sinners' dinner parties and hung out with them and stayed overnight in their houses. You have to get in the world to affect the world, but we can't be of the world at the same time. That's hard sometimes. You know, the closer you get sometimes to temptation, the more you can participate in it. So, like you, Rodney, you were talking about that person you were talking about, you know. There's a time when you do have to say no, I think. But here Paul's not concerned about his rights and privileges. One passion burns in his heart, and that passion is to reach everyone for Christ. And that's what he's for. That's what he's about. Every instruction of Jesus to the church when he says, "I give you the keys to the kingdom" in Matthew 16:19. "Therefore go and make disciples of all people," Matthew 28:19-20. "As the Father has sent me, I'm sending you," John 20:21. "And you will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth," Acts 1:8. All of that challenges us to get out in the world and to proclaim the gospel rather than huddling up with each other. And we have, as Christians, we have a tendency to do that. You know, we go do Christian things and we participate in Christian activities, but we got to be in the world too, and we do. And you'll find the more you're in the world proclaiming Christ, the more they respect you too. And some people might not, but a lot of people who are not Christians still respect the fact that you believe what you believe and you articulate it. Paul's not concerned with gaining anything for himself. He's concentrated on winning as many as he can to the kingdom of God. And he wants to become all things to all people in order to do that. You know, you can't really come across to a weak person by being a strong person. You know, you could be strong to them, but you first got to get where they're at. And the same way, if someone's a Jew, you don't want to right up front say, well, I don't really like Jews, but I'll talk to you. You know, we can't do it that way. Muslims, you know, lots of other people, Jehovah's Witnesses. You can't witness to a Jehovah's Witness by saying first thing you say is, well, you're a cult and I don't want to hear anything you say, you know. So there's a fine line there, but at the same time, we have to get in there and dig. We can't remain spotless and apart from everybody. And that's where a lot of these Christians go wrong and go out and live in the Nevada desert by themselves to separate themselves from the world and nobody to, not to have anything at all to do with the world. That ain't what Paul's talking about here either. Instead of focusing on our rights and privileges, we need to keep our focus on him. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So Paul here don't puff up. He don't get proud about what he's doing. He's very disciplined about doing it. You don't think about that, but Paul must have spent a lot of time planning what he was doing. Because he had to go into a town that was totally pagan worshipers and deal with this. He basically had to go into a Taliban town, you know, and start in a Jewish place and kind of work his way into starting a church. And that, it seems mind-boggling to think about just walking into a place and doing that. He doesn't give a thought to what's coming to him, and he takes no satisfaction in what he's already done. He just wants to make sure he's ready and able to run the race all the way to the finish. If you read through his writings and read Acts, you can see Paul was always preparing to do something else. You know, he was doing whatever he was doing. He was preaching wherever he was preaching. But at the same time, he was preparing for his next mission. You know, when he was going to Rome in chains, he was talking about going to Spain. You know, he was ready to go. He was that kind of guy. It's hard to imagine somebody that dedicated to the cause. But there's a little story here. In 1968, the Olympics were in Mexico City. And Mano Wolf of Ethiopia crossed the finish line to win the marathon, the foot race they have. For more than an hour after he came in, the spectators watched the other runners cross the finish line. When finally it seemed like everybody was in, the spectators were leaving the stadium, and they started hearing police sirens and whistles. And one last runner came in, John Stephen Akwari from Tanzania. He made his way into the track for the last lap. As he crossed the finish line, the remaining spectators cheered their approval. The reporter asked him why he had not quit since he had no chance of winning a medal. And John said, "My country did not send me to Mexico City to start the race. They sent me to finish the race." They sent him to finish no matter if he was the last one. So that's the desire that drives Paul. I'm not worried about my rights. I'm not concerned with my privileges. I'm not concerned with my income. I'm not concerned with all of those things. I'm not concerned where I'm going to sleep tonight or what kind of clothes I'm going to wear. But I just want to be in the middle of the fight, in the middle of the action, and always doing what my Lord wants me to do. As long as I have breath in my body, I beat my body and make it my slave so that after I preach to others, I won't be disqualified for the prize. And Paul fought with sin, you know, a lot. He wrote a whole chapter 7 of Romans. If you read it, that was all about Paul's struggle with the devil. You know, he was tempted and all that too. He wasn't this holy man who was always right. He had to fight. He had to fight with it. And we do too. You know, we have to fight every day to stay on our agenda. We have to keep our focus on the reason that the church existed. And it's not about meeting our needs, and it's not about following our agenda. It's following the agenda of Christ to share our witness and energize us and keep us going for that work that's ahead of us. So if you guys will come forward, we'll share the communion meal.